So endurance will get a runner to the finish line. That's the essential thing. But endurance with speed will get the runner there first. So speed, especially if your goal is to maintain a certain pace at a certain time, speed can't be ignored. It's also where most people that have started establishing themselves in marathons, maybe they started with purely plans that were based on endurance training, which is a great way to start. But that'll only get them so far. Like, okay, well, I want to get better now. The training has to get a little more nuanced, including elements for speed. It's very relative to how that gets implemented. I'm personally a fan of what I call non-linear periodization. Periodization is basically that adaptation cycle or progression. Linear periodization would be you're just doing basic slow running for X amount of weeks or however long, and then you start doing speed. Non-linear would be you're integrating little bits of speed all throughout, so they're overlapping. And so I like to use as an introduction to speed because you can't go out and just do heavy interval work right off the bat. You have to allow the body again to adapt to the speed demands because they are more stressful than an easy run. But things like strides at the end of a run, which are just like maybe 100 meters, or fartleks, which are like 30 seconds to start with, integrated into long runs or short runs or medium runs, are great ways to start training the body to handle the stress, but also it's training that speed element, the motor control, how fast neurons are firing and how quickly the legs can move. I believe it's really important to start integrating it pretty early to start adapting and being ready for those demands in training. It's also really important to consider holistically what is the course you're going to be running. Training for the Boston Marathon versus the Chicago Marathon. Boston has a lot of descent and ascent, so it's very rolling, very demanding, versus Chicago, which is quite a bit flatter. So those things have to be considered. Or if you're running a trail marathon, what is the course going to be like? So you want to make sure at some point strategically the features of the race are being integrated and adapted to progressively so that when you get to race day, you're ready for it and it's not a surprise, both mentally and physically. And again, speed training is going to be informed based on what's their goal time. A lot of apps tend to use heart rate as a measure of effort. There's a lot of research that talks about the limitations of using heart rate as a measure because it's actually quite subjective when you talk about max heart rate. There's the general formula of 220 minus your age, but that's like such a basic standard. It's actually not that accurate. They have to start somewhere with some kind of metric, but looking at your own heart rate trends, if you have that kind of data, is important to then compare among yourself, but it has to be weighed alongside perceived effort. Like, does this feel really hard? Do I feel like I'm stressing myself? And then alongside that, looking at your training pace, using times over distance based on personal records and some other factors to use all those to inform how fast should I actually be training. Because again, there's a limit. If you push yourself too fast, too strenuously, the likelihood of injury is very high, and it's not going to really benefit someone. This is kind of reiterating some principles, but the idea of in speed training, tempo is about sustaining a specific rate of motion. Anybody can run pretty fast. It's just how long can you sustain that? So tempo is in speed training is about prolonging how long that tempo can be maintained. And it's partnered with power, again, which is developed by things like strength training, which is how much basically does each step get you, how much distance. So tempo, power, those all are integrated in things like strides, fartleks, interval training. Those are three key models of interval training I like to use or think about, which is based on the Jack Daniels philosophy. They're different speeds with slightly different physiological benefits, but all have their value and all have their place, and they all have their percent that they should equate to for the week's mileage.